the managing director of the Gilliam Institute for Global Food Security at McGill University. I cordially welcome you all today as we have gathered here to celebrate one of the most important UN international days, that is the World Food Day. The collective action across 150 countries is what makes this day the most celebrated one in the UN Canada. I sincerely appreciate everyone's participation, especially in times when there is not much good news to go around. To begin with, the World Food Day is celebrated to honor the founding of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization back in 1945, and actually it was established in Quebec City in Canada. This event makes it possible to bring together governments, businesses, NGOs, media, and general public to prioritize and promote actions to transform the way the world produces and consumes food for better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life. Having said that, the future of food is in our hands. The World Food Day 2021 theme is Our Actions Are Our Future, which calls for the transformation of agri-food system to lead actively and healthy lives. Next, let us watch a very short video for the World Food Day 2021.
For each and every one of us, food tells a story. It starts with agriculture, and our actions impact its journey each step of the way. We have one planet and are part of one system. We must work together to build a better future. We need to reconnect with nature and work as one. Let's rewrite the story of food for a better, more sustainable world. Our actions are our future.
Perfect. I hope this works this time. I'm going to stop sharing now. And again, I continue. All right. This makes us realize that we need to be the part of the change, and therefore, in accordance with the UN Food System Summit 2021's priority solutions for people, planet, and prosperity for leveraging the power of the food systems. Our institute organized this presentation on measuring food system transformation and performance post-summit. Discussion will focus on actions considered to transform our food systems to achieve the SDGs by 2030, and the efforts required to change the route for developing sustainable agri-food systems capable for nourishing 10 billion people by 2050. I hope our today's discussion will contribute to a better understanding of the food systems, and more importantly, how we can all act together to achieve our targets. And I am now pleased to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Jean-Charles Le Vallée. Dr. Le Vallée is the country representative for the IICA delegation in Canada. Prior to joining IICA in 2019, Jean-Charles was the former head for food research at the Conference Board of Canada and a former World Bank food and commodity economist. Jean-Charles has also coordinated Canada's Food Security Bureau at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and managed the world's largest online food security community for the development gateway in Washington, D.C. He has extensive teaching and research experience in a dozen countries with the United Nations FAO, the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, the World Food Prize, USAID, Global Affairs Canada, and numerous universities such as Cornell, Laval, Michigan State, and Ryerson. Jean-Charles has written extensively on food issues, including a book on fostering food system resilience in Belize, and book chapter in India on political will for food security. He helped produce the 2014 Canadian Food Strategy and published various award rankings, over 100+ million media impressions across 17 OECD countries on food industry performance, agri-food trade, food safety, public trust, food security, healthy food, nutrition, disease and diets, food waste, and environmental performance. He also helped train agri-food SMEs in Colombia, Senegal, and Vietnam to grow their businesses and increase trade, as well as developed agriculture market information systems in Ethiopia, Mali, and Mozambique. He brings thought leadership to food policy, industry, and sector issues. He is a regular speaker and media guest in print, TV, and radio, and a frequent witness at Agri-Food and Trade Senate standing committees. Jean-Charles, the floor is yours.
C'est gentil, un grand merci, Patrick. Génial comme présentation et introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I'm really excited. World Food Day is fun because in Canada, we tend to celebrate it probably more than other places because it was founded here. It was founded in Quebec City in 1945. And the World Food Day, October 16th, is because that was the day FAO was established. And IICA is actually older than the UN. We were established in 1942, and we were recognized this year at the UN Food Systems Summit, IICA, as the food systems champion for the Americas. Maybe we can start with our presentation, Gloria. I'm going to ask my help from my colleague to share my perfect, so we can. Yep. So that's the first page. So I will say next slide when we're ready. Okay, Gloria. Basically, we have less than an hour, but I'm thinking probably half-hour presentation now. For those of you who don't know the Institute, I definitely wanted to share a bit more information about us because we work in food systems. We're a very important player in food systems in the Americas. So basically Canada to Argentina. McGill University had asked me to speak to food security, to speak to COVID briefly, and its impact on Latin America and the Caribbean. So I've got a little bit of statistics on that out of our recent Outlook report. I'm happy to share those links, those reports with you. Just reach out to us at IICA, and my email's on the first slide. My presentation's available and it's being recorded. So if you're missing some elements, you want to take notes, the video will be made available to the public. I've been working on metrics for about 2 or 3 decades. So I've got lots of experience in this area. I'm hoping that you'll find the information of value and interest and to your work and in your personal life even potentially. And then I think one of the best ways to reach out to the general public, to reach out to members of parliament, to governments, policymakers is through report cards. And I'll end with those with an example from Canada. So maybe we can talk about IICA briefly. Next slide, please. So we were established in 42. We have 34 member states. We're in every country, pretty much everywhere in the Americas but Cuba. We have also a country in Spain as a member with us who work and as an observer country. Our mandate has to do with agricultural development, has to do with rural well-being. All the ministers of agriculture of all the Americas sit on our board of directors. And so we are present on the ground. We have strong political ties, institutional ties. Our bread and butter is technical cooperation. A lot of that has to do with various elements, plethora of elements on food systems in the Americas. And to give you a brief introduction to IICA, I'll just finish and ask my colleague to share a video in Spanish, but there's some subtitles in English so you can follow.
La agricultura de nuestra América enfrenta un cambio de paradigma. El sector agropecuario está en plena transformación. Tiene un papel protagónico como garante del desarrollo económico y como impulsor de innovaciones y nuevas tecnologías. También como gran proveedor de soluciones a los problemas acuciantes de nuestro planeta, la inseguridad alimentaria y nutricional y las crisis poblacional, energética y ambiental. Nuestro hemisferio necesita una agricultura más productiva, inclusiva, resiliente, moderna y con gran participación de jóvenes y mujeres. El Instituto Interamericano de Cooperación para la Agricultura, IICA, trabaja para construir esa visión renovadora de la agricultura que alimente el hemisferio y el mundo, que genere oportunidades de desarrollo para los productores y los territorios rurales, Con el objetivo de cumplir con estos propósitos, el IICA promueve esa nueva visión a través de una plataforma hemisférica de gestión del conocimiento que transforma y prioriza la cooperación triangular y horizontal. Una hoja de ruta apoyada en 5 programas estratégicos guía el trabajo del IICA: bioeconomía y desarrollo productivo, cambio climático, recursos naturales y gestión de riesgos productivos, sanidad agropecuaria, inocuidad y calidad de los alimentos, desarrollo territorial y agricultura familiar, y comercio internacional e integración regional. 2 ejes son transversales a estos programas: género y juventud e innovación y tecnología. El IICA es un organismo de puertas abiertas que busca estrechar lazos con su comunidad y con las nuevas generaciones. Impulsa la creación del CIMAG, una fuerte propuesta educativa sobre las tecnologías que ya modernizan el agro. También construye la Plaza de la Agricultura de las Américas, un proyecto de interés público reconocido por el gobierno de Costa Rica. Cuenta con una casa rural, un espacio para el diálogo sobre la agricultura entre distintas generaciones, y alberga un Fab Lab especializado en la innovación tecnológica para reducir la brecha digital rural. Con 34 países miembros en las Américas, España como país asociado y 19 países observadores, el IICA, organismo del Sistema Interamericano Especializado fundado en 1942, tiene la misión de estimular, promover y apoyar los esfuerzos de los Estados miembros para su desarrollo agrícola y el bienestar rural, a través de la cooperación técnica de excelencia. Su máximo organismo de gobierno es la Junta Interamericana de Agricultura, conformada por los ministros encargados de Agricultura del hemisferio, quienes eligen al director general del IICA. El IICA ayuda a fortalecer la institucionalidad vinculada al agro, capacita, apoya en la formulación y la mejora de políticas públicas, desarrolla proyectos, comparte experiencias con los países y promueve la articulación de los actores del sector agrícola, incluyendo el diálogo público-privado. El IICA es una institución puente, vincula países, regiones y temas, trabaja con organismos internacionales y con la sociedad civil organizada. El IICA trabaja por el agro del futuro y por el futuro del agro. El IICA es la Casa de la Agricultura de las Américas.
Gracias, Gloria. Excellent. So next slide, so you can see where we work. It's basically everywhere. We are housed in Canada and in Ottawa, but as you saw in the video, our headquarters in Costa Rica. And the CIMAG is very cool. If ever you get to go to San Jose, please stop by the headquarters. There's even like a Minecraft ag station and Lego and a whole bunch of new technologies, tons of interactive materials. It's tons of fun. Great learning center. Next slide, please. So that's IICA. Briefly, I wanted to tell you about the SDGs because we're not the UN, but our member states are also members of the UN, and they have SDGs that they're trying to achieve, and we are there to help them, at least on the agriculture side and the food side. And so there are different elements that we try to align to the UN SDGs. There are other goals in the world, but this is one of the main, aspects of the 2030 agenda. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to share with you, because McGill had asked me to speak to some of the impacts. And COVID it's affected food systems, it's affected food security, loss of jobs, businesses have closed, and more people in poverty. There's downturn in trade, overall trade, not ag or food trade. That's actually gone up overall in the Americas. So the good news, it's very resilient sector, more unemployed. And then you have regions like the Caribbean, highly affected because the loss of tourism in itself from COVID became a greater loss, economic loss, than because of food access. Poverty became more of a food insecurity issue, affected diet, affected then more health issues beyond COVID. Overlay that with hurricane season. There was a volcano this year. There's a earthquake in Haiti. Like it's a big challenge to understand. If you're doing metrics and you want to capture all of that, there's no one single metric that does it. So you're going to need hundreds, depending on what you're trying to achieve in terms of your transformation, right? The change. That's the main theme from the UN Food Systems Summit, which I'll address. Next slide, please. More specifically on food security, this is from our Outlook report, which we did with IICA and FAO recently. And we have a specialist, Joaquin, at headquarters that can speak to this if you want to learn more. But you got some numbers here now in terms of on the food security impact. It's worse than it was. It was actually doing better before COVID, but the region was highly affected, like most places on the planet. You can see poverty's up, food security's up, and different types of severity of food insecurity. And so that's the way the FAO tends to define it. Many countries have different definitions. I was looking at an IFPRI study that surveyed like 300 or plus definitions. Like, it depends if it's community, if it's household, if it's a national supply issue, if it's a global metric. It really depends on how you define it. But there's some agreement on overall figures, usually based on calories, usually based on food availability. But if you use FAO data and you look at food availability in Canada, like adult equivalents, women need 1,800 kilocalories per day, men need 2,200 kilocalories per day, say on average, semi-active people, but the food supply in Canada is like 3,400. So according to FAO data, there's no food insecurity here, none, zero, which we know in Canada is not true. Then you overlay that and you look at other metrics like poverty and food access, which is the main issue in Canada, at least where we are here based. And suddenly you've got 4 million households and that are food insecure. So out of a population of 37 million people, that's a lot of people. So, 12% is pretty, it's a G7 rich country. So there's food insecurity everywhere. Depends on the metric you use. Next slide, please, Gloria. Right, so this is the rise I wanted to show you. This is the performance part, right? So one-off metrics are less interesting, cross-sectional picture, one time. It's informative, it helps, but it doesn't give you the performance. It doesn't show you the transformation, the change, the desired direction that you want. And this is not what we want. We want it to go down. You can see over time, even before COVID, it was going up. And relatively, right? The relative is not absolute terms. So it may be less people, but over the whole population, it could be more. So it depends on the metric, right? So next slide, please. But at least I want to show you the trend. It's not getting better. What I did want to show you, though, in Latin America is that I told you the economy as a whole, it went down like 7-8%. But in terms of exports, in terms of growth, you saw a lot of resilient sectors. People need to eat. So it usually tends to do, and we saw that in the financial crisis, like 2008, the same thing happened. It was very, very resilient sector. And so here you can see there's some growth. I've got, next slide, please. I want to show you, that's right. So you've got it, it's a bit small, but you can see it per country, the bottom. And so some countries did really, really well, more than others. And I also dug further to figure out from using the data there, that which sectors were doing best. And it turns out that cane sugar, this is in order, right? So cane sugar is the commodity that was most resilient and kept growing, like more demand for sugar. So, and then that's at the production level. And sugars in many things. And then the WHO will say, be careful, don't eat more than 5 grams of added sugar, which is not natural sugar, So it's very different for a consumer to understand the difference too. So we need more food literacy, more food education to better understand the nuances there. And so you can see soya, pork, cotton, coffee. So many sectors did really well, and many countries actually grew over COVID. So some resilience there in the sector, in the industry. Next slide, please. And then the importance on the environment. The sustainability is more popular. Environment's more popular. You're seeing a lot more talk about the biosphere, about integrity, about issues around sustainability. I think people are moving on, and there's some people may get confused because sustainability can be economic sustainability, it could be social sustainability. It applies to many things. So usually people tend to think about environmental sustainability. And traditionally, they would only look at one factor, like greenhouse gases. But in truth, if you're gonna look at air quality, you got to look at particulate matter, or you got to look at ammonia. Like there's a lot of other factors or metrics or data out there that we need if we want to be as comprehensive as we can. And the Americas play a leading role in biodiversity as a food basket for the planet. And you can see I put some numbers here. Important for fresh water, important for expansion. Maybe there's a nuance there because the expansion is due to like loss of forests. So deforestation is an issue. So you're seeing that there's well, we have to make some choices. So the next slide, please. I just want to give you I would say on the last slide, just to add that you're seeing more talk about being more smarter and more responsible. So that's not just a fashion, it's reality. I think if we're serious about what our future, if there are food future, these are issues that we'll need to address. Now, one element on the previous slide that I didn't mention was soils. And we've launched a new initiative last year with Dr. Ratan Lal, the World Food Prize winner from 2020. And he and I and others are working on addressing soils because there's a foundation there for food security. There's a foundation. You can't really achieve the SDG goals without a solid soil health, overall soil health and soil fertility and all these other metrics. I wanted to tell you that in terms of Latin America, it's a very, very pressing issue. It's accelerating, it's getting worse. So I put some numbers here quickly. You can see half the land is exposed to water erosion. Over half is degraded to salinity, to acidity. What are some of the leading causes? You're seeing some desertification actually happening. And it's very resilient, but not very productive. So resiliency gets to, most people tend to think of it positively, but there's such a thing as resilience traps. And so too much resilience is not a good thing either. So it depends on how you perceive it, how you define it. That's important to understand the metrics too, because you want to achieve those aspirational goals. And so we need a paradigm shift. It's not just an economic loss. The soil is not easy to rebuild. So it takes time, and we need to invest in soils. So next slide, please. So like I was saying, Living Soils in the Americas is the initiative that we've launched with Dr. Ratan Lal. Basically, we're trying to tackle soil degradation. And if you're going to do that, you're concerned by soil fertility and soil erosion. So, and contamination. And there are a range of metrics that you can use. Some countries have strong data sets around soils. Canada measured it every 5 years for over 25 years, and you can see the trends. It's fantastic. But in other countries, they have no cell data. There's no geospatial data. It's really difficult and challenging to actually implement a policy or try to make management decisions because you just don't have the data to make the proper informed decision. Next slide, please. Right, talking about definitions. There are lots. I told you about the definition about food insecurity. Food systems are defined in so many ways. I found a dozen graphics and charts and ways and I thought, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to give you one purposeful definition for me, for the purposes of today for the talk. And some key messages or key words in there. It's dynamic. It's always an evolution. It's sequential. It's repeated. It's looping. It's like, and it's, people tend to think of linearly often in supply chains, from upstream and primary ag to downstream consumption kind of thing. And that's normal. I mean, a lot of people work this way, but it's a bit of a silo. So you want to be more comprehensive. You want to be more, have more food systems thinking, beyond this linear approach. And so I've put a range of issues in here, and all the way down to waste, storage, and recovery. And food waste is misunderstood. Almost all of it in the planet is modeled. We don't actually have any real measurements of food waste. And then people tend to lump in food loss. And food loss is along the supply chain, and food waste is post-purchase, right? So at the consumption level. So you need to distinguish that, and that very different answers and solutions to each issue. And nothing to be proud of in Canada. We are among, if not the most wasteful society per capita in the planet. Over 100 kilograms per year per person, like with the Australians. So on the food loss side, it would be Canada's like 2-3% in the entire supply chain in terms of OECD countries, with Denmark tied for last. So that we've got work to do here, at least in Canada. I noticed if you have any chats, I'll get to them at the end. I saw Alexandra wrote a note. There's a Q&A, and I'll manage the quick chats after my presentation. And that definition is my own, Alexandra, as the quick answer. So next slide then, please, Gloria. Right, so you need clarity. You need simple metrics. A lot of our thinking, even when in '95, when I was in Quebec City launching a website for the 50th anniversary of the FAO, like Netscape 1 had just come out. And it was really cool because we were doing basic HTML and scripting, and it's prehistoric now, but we were online voting. It was tons of fun. And we discovered that there were no metrics around, that we weren't working with quantitative. It was a lot of wisdom, lots of experience, a lot of qualitative information, which is valuable, but it doesn't provide the evidence-based to make better informed decisions. So if we want to push for food systems transformation, like at the UN Food Systems Summit a couple weeks ago, we're going to need a lot more data. We're going to need clearer data. We're going to need practical data that's actionable, easily measurable, that leverages change, right? And change in terms of food systems transformation in the direction we want. What is it that we want? Well, we want to be more sustainable. We want healthier diets so that people have healthier, longer lives, right? Or we want it more responsible in terms of the food system, our actions, and no economic, environmental footprints. Like, let's just have, and there's a net zero kind of 2050 agenda coming along. It's starting. It's not there yet, but it's in many places there's some uptick. You want to spur people to act. And to that, it has to be meaningful to them, and not only work with governments, because governments are member nations that go to this UN Food Systems Summit, but what you really need a whole bunch of other stakeholders that get buy-in and do. And the value of lies in the ability to inform decisions. And then you look at areas where you're not doing well, and then you channel your resources and you redefine the metric, and you get better. You're more perfectionist over time, and you have. Starting from a baseline, agreed direction where all of us are measuring the same thing, which is another challenge. Next slide, please. Right. The key here is driving action. Sometimes you'll have the best data and some people will just ignore it. Ideology, politics, pressure, investment decisions. There are a lot of reasons why we don't do what we should be doing. And here I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of that, like the reasoning and the values. If we're going to do a process, make sure you've got a baseline, make sure you've got aspirational goals, make sure that you've got a surveillance system, a structure in place that is global, that we've all agreed on the same metrics, because it's difficult if each country does its own thing. Even subnational metrics in Canada, provinces sometimes do their own thing. It's a challenge to be able to work together if we're not working on the same data. Yeah, that's fine. Go next slide, please. This is one of those systems that just came out right after the Food Systems Summit. I was reading over it. It's fantastic. I think it's one of the examples in the world where we're coming together, we're agreeing on a set of metrics, a baseline, and a whole range of areas out of Johns Hopkins leading it anyway. So Dr. Fonza, Lawrence Haddad, and FAO and others. So, I mean, it's worth, the publication from Food Policy is free. If you're in the metric world, you'll love this paper. It reflects a lot of my thinking from 10 years ago, and I'm happy to see that they've got this food systems monitoring observatory, I call it, in place, because that's the kind of thing the world needs right now. Next slide, please. Yeah, so limitations. You can see I was trying to get to that. Nothing captures the entire food system, and the food systems are so diverse, and we can work with, and from my training, I have a more of a Western scientific approach. But when I start working with the Inuits in the Arctic, or when I work with remote areas in sub-Saharan Africa, or even Latin America, like you go to these places, their world is very different from the world that I know, from like urban North America, or European style, or very highly industrialized countries. So those metrics need to reflect, and we need to tailor them and regionalize them so they're meaningful, but speak to each other. So they need to find what I call the synergies. There are a whole bunch of reasons why we can't work with data. I listed some here. You can see the reasons. If you work in this world, you know. Next slide, please. So yeah, data gaps. This is from my own experience. And if you're working on, I gave you an example of food waste. Resilience isn't properly measured. Others call it food defense. I have an example here I'll show you in a second on foodborne illness. Like, there's no global database on this. No one does it. So I had to go nationally to countries to go deep down into their data sets on their statistics departments or ag departments or whoever was doing it, public health departments, to figure out. And sometimes the clicking is like 25 clicks to get to the data. It's really deep. It's not dark web stuff. This is just public data that's hard to, and it's not available. So you really, it requires a lot of attention and investment in time. Some databases are not accessible. They're proprietary, usually private sector. Some cases they're in early development. Like, I struggle with the ones like on biodiversity. We tend to focus more on the vertebrates, less on plants, or less on like even worms, what I call man's best friend. And I'd like to see more invertebrates. I'd like to see more work around biodiversity. We don't do enough on carbon footprint and other areas. There was some life cycle. There's things out there, but they're not talking to. There's not that synergies I keep looking for. So we speak to each other. They're collected infrequently. In Canada, our nutrition cycle, like our latest data is 2015. Before that was 2004. Before that was 1972. So you can't really make good informed nutritional policy if your data is outdated and it's not complete. So we need to have data. I would recommend at least 5 years, every 5 years or better, annually. Some countries are doing it annually. I think Japan does it. And some countries do it every 10 years. Some do it once off. Like it's a small investment, frankly, compared to everything else. Like, I would highly recommend every government do this and get a sense of the nutrient, because the most important part of health, human health, is food. It's the first determinant, in my view. So anyway, food safety is another one. Summer follow. These are examples of operational metrics. They're not adequate to demonstrate food system transformation one-off. You need the same information over time. And then it becomes an idea. Okay, no, it should, Michael, my son should be fine. I'm at the office. Next slide, please. Right, so this is an example of the food system metrics I put together a couple of years ago when I was head of food research at the conference board. I worked with, I called in over a friend, Sylvain Charlebois from Dalhousie. You don't know if you know him. They usually call him the food professor now. So he had done previous work at Saskatchewan, 2010 and 2008. And I wanted to review to get a sense of change over the last 4 years from his first report in 2010. And we were doing at the time a study on developing a food strategy for Canada. So we thought, where does Canada rank? And how do, among peer countries? I didn't do the whole world. A lot of the world doesn't have sufficient data. That's an example of the positive data gaps in the world. And so here data, pesticide use is very old data. A lot of it's often based on sales. It's not even on applications. Or if you got TDS, which is total diet size, which is chemical risks at consumption. But in Canada, we do, in one city, 1 year. Like it's not sufficient to get a proper view, a bird's eye view of the entire risk at consumption or foodborne illness. And I used 5 different metrics. And I did, like I said, I had to dig down to kind of figure out, to develop my own aggregate index. It didn't exist. And I reached out to various people, OEI and others, EFSA, USDA, CFA, CFI. We spoke, but there was no global data sets. So I did my own digging. The rest is food recalls, traceability, labeling, allergens. The allergen one has, I think I put about, how many in it? There's probably 7 metrics in there, 9 metrics. Traceability had 10 metrics, foodborne illness had 5. Like you need a set of metrics to be, and as I often see, groups only use one, and then that's how they determine the food safety index. It's not complete, it's not comprehensive, it doesn't tell the whole story. You need a lot more than 1 to 3 metrics to explain performance and transformation and to get a sense of direction. And some things are more challenging, like compliance. You can't really get those. Anyway, next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So this is I only took one of the 10 that you saw grouping. So this is by this is like the microbial risk, which I did 8 years ago now. And so you can see OECD countries and the changeover from 2010. And so you can see some places there's no data. Some countries, I don't know how they do it, but they only report 10 cases of E. coli that entire year, which is impossible. So if it's true, then everyone would be doing it. Like there's some things in the data that is questionable, but at least the per 100,000 people in terms of microbial risk is comparable. Everyone kind of measures it the same way. It's robust. I like it. I have confidence in the data, and it informs policymakers, and in public policy, it informs actions by citizens. Food citizens take their information often from media, from TV and other. So the media has a major role to play. So we share this report with media. It got hundreds of millions of media impressions. Next slide, please. Right. So goals are important. It's what gives you direction, right? So the world has agreed to these 2030 agenda items, the SDG goals. There are many targets. Food, it doesn't affect all of them, but a good set of them at least. I think it's a lot better than the MDGs. There are only 8. They were, we're very far off from achieving any of that. There was less momentum. Now there's a lot more momentum and awareness and understanding. But maybe too much focus on the SDGs. I'd like to see more people focus on the other elements. I put here just some examples quickly. There are climate change goals. There are biodiversity goals and targets. Desertification is an issue. It's probably going to become an issue in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan, Canada, in the next 30, 40 years, according to modeling anyway, you were in earlier. So food access, food water quantity is also an issue beyond water quality. So from experience, having worked with the Rome Declaration, having worked on Belize when I did my PhD there and their food strategy, I worked on a food strategy here in Canada through the conference board. I also was an advisor to the Quebec food strategy. They don't call it that, but it's like a lot of people agree on the aspirational goals. The high level stuff is fine. And what you tend to see is that there's a disagreement on how to achieve them. And it's very parochial. And there's not one food economy. No one is working strategically towards the same goal. So it's messy. And and different groups will say different things. Like civil society often will think government should take the lead. But government often will say industry has a more of a leading role than we do. And we're there to facilitate the right environment, all those good things. And then civil society disagrees that industry should lead because not everyone is comfortable with that. And industry is wondering how to lead often, but then they have their own strategies, usually by commodity, which are quite solid, but they're usually around economic. They're much more sustainable now, which is fun. And they're much more health oriented. You're seeing a lot more One Health approaches. There's more in the last few years, and even with COVID, even better now, awareness raising about, and the UN Food System kind of allowed us to discuss it even further around the world. To me, that was the best benefit from the summit. And the pre-summit was actually, in terms of content, was a lot better. Next slide, please. Right, but there's momentum. That's what I was just saying. We got to use this to work on these metrics, to work together and to find those synergies and to fill those data gaps and to address the range of issues that are, some of it is new. like true accounting. You're seeing a lot of talk about that now. And there's more acceptance. It takes time. So you got to build that momentum and don't lose it. Then you have to rebuild it again. I've gone through strategies. There is such a thing as food strategy fatigue. I've gone through that. It's not fun because then you lose investment, you lose data, people stop reporting. Like you have to continue the interest through media, through communications that are easy to understand. Red, yellow, green, report cards, something that not too technical, not too scientific. Reach to the public that can push pressure and put pressure on their governments too, and even act themselves because it's in their own self-interest. So next slide, please. Yeah, what's this kind of what I was saying? It's like we need the science, so we need the evidence. It has to be academic, but if we stay in that realm, it's going to be less successful. And so we need to make it, sensibilisation, we would say in French, the idea is to make it accessible to everyone, to a larger public, to all the actors, so they find the value, the buy-in, the meaning, so it resonates, so that they invest themselves in data, especially industry. And so we tend to focus a lot, we tend to work a lot more with governments, less with all the other stakeholders, and even the non-food stakeholders need to play a role. And we have to build those synergies too, outside the synergies in data. To me, that's the motivation. Next slide, please. So yeah, just another example. People don't know that the National Geographic did some work on food literacy. It's not well understood. Most countries don't have food literacy data at all, none. And food literacy is now with COVID has come back. There's more food resonates. It's more tangible. It's more palpable. It's more, people have a better, stronger connection to food now than they had pre-COVID. That's the kind of general sense. Here, I wanted to give you a sense of all the metrics that go in under food literacy, because in Canada, a lot of Canadians have struggled with food labels. They struggle with understanding the numbers. The major gap here is Canadians don't have the numeracy skills, the math, sufficient math to understand basic labeling. So make it more simple would be nice. Food education hasn't always worked. But here you've got different elements to show you that not even half the population, if you look at the last, I put B's and C's because less than half the population have sufficient food literacy to understand different elements. What is organic? How is the food safe? Is it local? Is it, do you observe food labeling at all? And it turns out that Japan is behind, even though they considered among the most healthy people on the planet. Apparently they have very low food literacy. So it's cultural then. They just don't maybe understand the science behind it, but they understand food. And so our understanding of food literacy has to change in terms of its definitions and the metrics we measure to capture why Japanese people are so healthy. So much. Anyway, next slide. Oh, I put home ec out. You'll see we took out, like we're not teaching food in schools anymore in many places in the world. So it's a mistake. If food has to come back, if you're not learning it at home, you're not learning in school, you're left with internet, chefs, industry information. Like some of that is very good, but we need to have more practice, more food handling, touching food, developing that connection young. So if you're going to go from metrics to change, we want to foster, that food system transformation. And metrics are one of the best tools we can do it with. But if there's a pathway, and I'm suggesting, and this is from experience, you've got your baselines. So you're starting from somewhere, and you inform that direction based on that difference. So you have targets, and the targets are really helpful because they can be actionable, right? What you want is workable solutions to achieve that target, which then become outcomes themselves. And the outcomes are the evidence of the change. And a lot of people are outcome oriented, so that's fine. I'm happy with that. And let's just focus on the metrics to feed into the outcomes that are inspired by goals. And usually the goals are aspirational, and no one disagrees, let's lower the obesity. No one disagrees, let's be more sustainable. No one agrees on, let's be more profitable too. The food industry, like they have to stay in business. And then you can work with very, very small farmers. And what they want is to reduce their food insecurity. And they have half a hectare of land. And there are 5 people and they have to grow, 200 kilograms of grain a year. That's a ton a year. And they have, if they're lucky, a ton per hectare of production. That's half of what they need. So, we have to work more in production. But you're going to see a lot of people say, oh, we need to double production by 2050. That's not true. Now I'm seeing a lot more 70%. And actually, I've already started seeing 60 and 50% because we're much better at recovery and reducing food loss and food waste. And so really our modeling is improving. And we need, to feed more people by 9.5 billion now. We have probably enough food to do it now. So we just have to be better at managing food. Next slide, please. Right. More arguments in favor of metrics, really. It's self-evident. I'll let you read it. I want to get consensus, though. I'm trying to get those synergies, right? And I mean, IICA can play a role, but we are one among many, many players. Our member countries are players. Our UN sister organizations, if you want to call it that, are players. And then we've got within the IICA Inter-American System, PAHO and Inter-American Development Bank and others. We work with the media often. We work with farmers, and so we've got access to a whole range of stakeholders and non-food stakeholders that I think that is really the prime time because there's so much interest now in these issues to maximize and optimize that potential now. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I mean, it's an example of all the data out there and all the food system trackers out there. Like IICA does partial tracking in different ways. We've got a great outlook report. One of my most favorite indices in the planet is the one by the Economic Intelligence Unit. And so they have a global food security index. It's probably among the most comprehensive in the planet. There are others, like I really liked, countries don't tend to usually produce food strategies or food policy. Canada just has one, and they don't have the metrics or the data to feed into informing that policy or that strategy. UK had one, and the 20 food strategy was quite good, but they shelved it. But the Scots have a food and drink strategies, more industry oriented, but I mean, there are elements or pockets in there that is useful for the whole planet in terms of best practices and how to maintain momentum. And then I put a whole bunch of different groups here that are doing work, but they don't talk to each other often. There's not that synergy element I'm looking for. And the World Benchmarking Alliance, they did a big thing on right after the Food System Summit, and they're doing some reporting, but they only work on the 350 top, like that kind of largest food firms. So, which is that's a different way of portraying the food system, and it's interesting, but it's not sufficient. So we need a broader picture. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just another example to give you on salt and sodium consumption. We all know the whole world, WHO, we all try to, and you and I both have to be careful about our sodium intake, right? And blood pressure and hypertension. And it turns out that the basic upper daily limit that the WHO is suggesting is 2,300 milligrams sodium. And even 1,500 would be even better. I'm trying to give you here a picture, like the one on the left is some old, decade-old data, but I ranked salt intake, and sodium is about 40% of salt, so it gives you an idea. And Canada is among the lowest consumers of sodium. And then the Japanese, again, among the greatest consumers of sodium in the planet, or salt on the planet. Yet their overall health is stronger than most nations. So, it's very, very interesting, the case that in the Japanese. In Canada, what I did for you on the right side is to show you that, first off, in the left side, you see that no country is meeting the WHO requirement. And on the right side, you can see provincially, subnationally, we have data in Canada that shows us that consumption is better, maybe in Newfoundland and Ontario, and in Quebec, is where you see the most consumption of sodium. And that's true in Quebec. It's kind of particular because the food culture is very different. They tend to consume more salt, more saturated fat, more sugars. They also cook the most at home. They also eat the most fruit and vegetables. Like, it's very interesting to compare subnationally the dynamics, which are lost when you aggregate up nationally. So, there's work to do. And sodium is an easy metric to capture, but it's not sinking in. And then you saw Campbell's soup, reduce their sodium entirely, and they lost market share. People wanted sodium; they were used to sodium. So instead of like maybe doing it incrementally, they then smack one off, and it had an impact on their business. Next slide, please. Right, that's what I'm just talking about, the differences subnationally and nationally, globally. Comparing. I show you the food system data. It's tough to compare apples to apples in food safety, and let alone all these other metrics. We do a good job usually on food availability. FAO's been reporting on food security. SOFI reports, very good stuff, but it's availability. So it doesn't capture a lot of the stuff. If you do more food access elements, then you're seeing a broader, more realistic picture, and captures poverty, which is often the main issue for food insecurity. And then there's wars and civil strife and stability issues that play effect. And there are other reasons. And there's hidden malnutrition, right? Beyond kilocalories, there's vitamin D deficiencies, iron anemia, iodine, and then even in Canada, we had 10% of our population is vitamin D deficiencies. So because we're a Nordic country, less sun for 6 months in the winter kind of thing. So anyways, you can see the value added arguments I put here. We can share this presentation. Next slide, please, Gloria. I'm trying to go fast now. I'm a bit over time. I mean, I think I have a few minutes left, and you may have questions. So I did want to give you some ideas that things that are happening now that I'm really excited about. You saw the one from Johns Hopkins and their initiative, and they did a side event at the UN Food System Summit. What you're seeing now is a lot more talk about accountability. That's really good. It's good for the world. And one way they're doing that is through the promotion of true cost accounting. And so the various groups that are talking about that and pushing for it, and there are ways to measure it. And so it's kind of more nascent, but in food at least. And I'm excited to see how that's going to play out. Traditionally, you see a lot more work about food security, from prices to markets to trade to nutrition to diets, and what's growing in interest and in industry and in government is a lot more talk about sustainability and equity and resilience. I'm happy because I did a PhD in food system resilience over 15 years ago, and no one was talking about it. It was like only vulnerability, and it was vanguard at the time. And I suggested some metrics and stuff. So I'm happy that we're catching up, and I'm really pleased about that. What I would like to see more is what I put in the last one on the bottom here. It's where it says generally absent. And it ranges from a whole bunch. We tend to focus on very specific elements of the environment, or we hardly ever talk about food safety. We're seeing a lot more talk about governance and rights and labor, and that's all good. But I'd like to see more on mental health issues. Most countries have no mental health strategy. There's no work, like we've worked on food education, but it's not a comprehensive food literacy strategy. You tend to focus, members of parliament tend to focus more on primary ag than any other sector in the supply chain. We tend to be more land-based, so we tend to forget fisheries. And although aquaculture is a form of farming, it's not fishing. But we need more work on the oceans and ocean health and the fisheries, more work on the indigenous food systems, more work on animal welfare, very tough data to put together. There's very little on research and development in the world. Multi-factor productivity. There are some proxies, there's some ways to measure that, but I'd like to see more investment, and because we need to be smarter and more responsible about food, and food innovation is like so important to achieving and to feeding the future. And so, and it doesn't have to be product development, it can be organizational development, it could be procedural, it could be best practices, very smart. But then no-till uses more fertilizer, so you got to balance that, you know. That. The regulatory environment, its impact, and I put here market concentration. And I know Jennifer Clapp would be happy about this because they didn't talk about the UN Food Systems Summit, and she's been talking about this for decades. So, you know, it's an important measure. It affects food prices. It affects our interaction with food, our accessibility to food, especially for those food insecure. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end now. I've got a couple slides here to show you that this is work I did when I was head of food research at the Conference Board Canada with a colleague of mine. We compared OECD countries because that's where the base data sets are. And we did it in a report. Everyone in the world who has been to school understands report cards. You don't need more training. You understand report cards. And it's one of the best ways to communicate to larger populations, in people in government, and senators and governors and members of parliament and presidents. And, you know, if you've got 2 minutes with a president, and I've met about a dozen now, you need to have that spiel ready to go. And what's important, and food policy and food strategies and metrics and the health of their population and the, you know, prosperity of their food industry. So this is one way. What I really want to show you on the left is all the different ways we came up with representing the future and the prosperity of the food industry. They're a major, major employer, millions of people. You know, I saw the group at Johns Hopkins, they were giving a presentation on their webinar on their side event, and they said that 4.5 billion people in one of their slides are related to their livelihoods related to food. So, I mean, that's more than half the planet. We've got to do better. And we've got to capture those. There are a lot of people that are absent from the traditional food supply chain. So let's work with them to figure out the metrics to capture everybody. And I put here, you know, more of a Western, but I've got some innovation. I've got some metrics from regulations. You know, it's pretty rare. You don't see that in most of the world. So I'm trying to, you know, this is a national data from Canada compared to OECD countries, and we were able to capture most of it. So you have to do your due diligence to capture all those metrics. Next slide, please. And then I think this is my last slide. I wanted to give you another example of all the metrics that go into a database, that go into food systems transformation, our understanding of change, to to foster a difference in our lives, in our livelihoods, to be better at producing it, but at eating it too. You know, like, let's not just eat to live, let's live to eat. And so what I've got here is like more industry prosperity because the metrics at a subnational or national level are very different in terms of their availability globally. And then if you start digging, the other countries actually do it too, but I can't compare them. Not the same year, not the same methodology. You kind of want to look at the differences and you show, but that's not an honest comparison. And then I got food safety and even animal welfare. And you can see in terms of household food security. And I even put like household emergency supply kits, which was low, before COVID. So with COVID, a lot of people, they became food insecure. And not that they should have been, because they have decent incomes, but they just weren't ready for such an impact. That goes with hurricanes and shocks to food economies and a whole bunch of other disasters. And then I put the environment. You can see a range of issues here. What I find, I just want to mention the environmental farm plans. They're very good. It's a smart addition to and beneficial management practices in Canada. They're very good, but farmers tend to let the environmental risk aside unless it affects their business risk. And then you'll see investment on the environmental side. So like there's a lot more environmental farm plans in Quebec because it's immediate, they're affected by water quality issues now, than say the prairies, which, you know, I think it's about 80-20%, the differences in farmers adopting a farm plan because it's not yet an environmental issue on the farm for it doesn't affect their business. So, you know, they've got irrigation is working. But water quality and quantity will be an issue one day. The last one is on healthy food and diets. And there's so much more in there. We tend to focus more on kilocalorie consumption, a few micronutrients, and not that that's not important. It's a beginning. And if you go down, you can see, and I've got these reports. All this is published work. So if you want the, by province and by OECD country, I'm happy to share, and just email me. We'll send you copies. But I did want to add, we've got elements in there beyond food. It's about beverages, and it's about drinking responsibly, and it's about food labels. And how do you assign? Is it food literacy, food education issue? So it's a health issue. Where do you position it? And there's lots of debate on each metric, hours, days, and disagreements. So, and that's just a small team. Imagine the world. I think that's my last slide. Gloria, next slide. Yeah. Okay. Good. So, big thank you. Eat well. My mom would say, she passed away now, but she would say, what was her expression all the time? Eat well, bake often. And actually, I was baking too often, and during COVID, I've gained like 10 pounds. So I have to work that off. No more cookies for my kids, and the pastries and the pies and the breads. So I'm off carbohydrates for a little bit. Merci, Patrick.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Charles, for this very insightful presentation. Actually, with the limitation of time, I'm going to allow maybe for one extra quick question. Gloria, if you want to share the question with Jean-Charles.
Well, Michael is asking in the chat, you can see, yes, there is disagreement. But there's agreement like with the SDG goals, the 2030 agenda. There's agreement now on like domains. Then as you break it down, that's where you get more and more disagreement. There's no disagreement really on the aspirational high level. They break it and you bring it down, and then you have to actually invest in data. You can't just go with whatever is available. I mean, that's where your starting point. That's low hanging fruit. But really what you want is you need to identify those data gaps before you establish that baseline. Make sure you've got it proper, and then you have to refine them over time. You're going to learn, well, maybe that wasn't the best metric. So then you speak to other countries. We work as a team, as a planet, respecting our planet boundaries. That within this world that we live in, we work with these synergies and agreement on, and each country does their own thing. And if you can't, then maybe some countries can go to, to give you an example, I was working in Ethiopia for 3 years, and they had a statistics department. And, I drink tea all the time. This cup had 3 different names, 3 different volumes, and in 651 words or whatever, like it's a mess. It was very complicated to actually get an accurate measure of food production. And I actually was able to produce numbers using their data that showed they had enough food to feed the country. But they didn't like that because they were getting food aid. So they kicked me out of the country. So, it becomes real. It's tangible for a lot of people. I'm trying to see, Benoit, I've got the data on Australia. Yes, I agree, Kevin. Japan argument, we're not capturing everything properly. That's also in Japanese, so I have to translate to English, at least from my understanding. That's my experience. We have to do a better job in culturally exchanging on data and to better agree on the same metrics, the same volumes, the same methodologies. And there's a question here from Benoit. Metrics, yes, they are complex, Benoit. Well, you need to train. If you're going to use the metrics, you need people who are trained in Yeah, well, setting targets is often political. A community can do it. Usually a sector will do it, commodity-based sector. There's no general way of doing it. Groups of people who, in French we say, qui se ressemblent, s'assemblent. So they're the ones who are going to, get together and agree on putting together some group of metrics that is meaningful to them. And they will buy in and invest in those metrics once it becomes meaningful. Industry does that too. You kind of work with public data first, and then they have their own metrics in terms of their profitability and all this. But in terms of sustainability, it's new, so they need additional outsourced outsource data, and they go to public data to inform their decisions. And then you see their own investment, because then they see the valuable, because it's important to the consumer, their clients. It's really interesting dynamics there. Patrick?
Jean-Charles, thank you so much again. And you remind me indeed of the famous quote of Edward Deming: "You can't manage what you don't measure." So that's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much. Well, we have reached to the end of our World Food Day celebration, and without taking much time, I'd like to pass on my sincere thanks to our today's speaker and his team from IICA, and acknowledge all the great and insightful learnings received from the webinar. I'm also very grateful to all the attendees for joining us today and making this event a great success, actually. This year, World Food Day will be marked second time while countries around the world deal with the unprecedented effects of the global pandemic. From what we learned today, it is clear that now it is time to look into the future we need to build together, right? The sad reality is that still more than 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet due to system inefficiencies. And hence individuals like us and you guys need to participate in the system for transforming diets as the food that we choose and the way we produce, prepare, and cook and store. It makes us an integral part and active part of this agri-food system. Let me conclude by saying that we need to align our actions for addressing different challenges without compromising the economic, social, and environmental basis to develop a sustainable agri-food system. Thank you so much all, and happy World Food Day to all. Thank you.
Stay safe, everybody.